My name is Annette Gordon-Reed. I'm the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History here at Harvard Law School. And it is my pleasure to welcome you here to conversation with my dear friend, Loretta Lynch, who almost needs no introduction, but I will give her one anyway. Loretta's connections to Harvard start at Harvard College. She's a graduate of the Harvard Law School. She is my classmate, 1984. And we went to the same law firm after graduation. We became friends. She is the godmother of my daughter, Susan, with my husband, Robert Reed, who's also a classmate. So this goes back a very, very long way. And I cannot be more thrilled to be here with her this evening on this august occasion from last night and today, and just this wonderful celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Harvard Law School. Loretta began her career as an associate at Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell in New York City. She went to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. She was
Brooklyn.
In the house. In the house. It's too bad it's not the Bronx. You could have said boogie down. But Brooklyn, in the house. And then she became the United States Attorney in the Clinton administration. She was back in private practice, Hogan and Hartson, but then Hogan and Lovell it became, I suppose, after that. Am I getting this right? Yes?
Absolutely.
And she came back for another stint as the United States Attorney in the Obama administration, and then became, after a little bit of a delay, the Attorney General of the United States of America. I have to say it was one of the greatest periods of my life and my husband's life, because we always say that no matter if we were having a down day or something was getting to us, we could say, well, at least Loretta is the Attorney General. And that would brighten everything up from that. So it's wonderful to be here after all these years in a conversation with her on this occasion. So first I'd like to start off and ask you, how did you decide you wanted to become a lawyer? And a compound question, how did you decide to come here for law school?
You know, my path to law school was actually a little circuitous. When I was a kid, it was one of the things that I thought about, as I'm sure many of us are in that same situation. But I actually was very much torn between law and journalism. I really love the opportunity to tell a good story. And I really love the opportunity to do a little bit of investigative journalism as well. When I was here at the college, I worked on a student television show, and it was a public affairs show through the closed circuit network that not too many people knew existed.
Well, I didn't know, but
we did that. And I would run around and interview different people on campus and throughout the Harvard community, as well as in the Boston community. Although I remember when I was in college working on that student show, there was a mayoral election at the time, and we were trying to talk to the mayoral candidates. They talked to us. And this is still, at that point, it was right around, I think, 79, 80, when, those of us working on the show, it was a very diverse group, black students, white students, but we wanted to interview people in South Boston because they were having a very strong voice in the mayoral election. And I remember, as the producer of that particular segment, deciding that I should not go to South Boston because even though I wanted to go and I wanted the experience, it was not going to get the story the way that we needed to get. So, the issues that we're dealing with now are not new. So I was torn between law and journalism, and ultimately I thought that as an advocate, I could still tell a story and also affect a change. I could tell a story or help someone else tell their story, and that's ultimately what I was able to do, particularly when I became a prosecutor. I was able to help witnesses and people who've been harmed tell their stories and actually get some measure of justice. So that was my thought process at the time. When I was here, I will say I thought, well, I'll combine these interests and do First Amendment law, some sort of communications law, but ultimately kept finding myself pulled into public service. When I thought about Harvard Law School, I did think about going someplace else. I'd spent 4 years at the college, which for me was great. I'm from North Carolina. And wanted very much to leave my home state and be in a different state and meet new people. And of course, you realize that you get here and people are the same wherever they are. And the same issues exist also, particularly in terms of how people view you, whether you're a woman or a minority and all. It's just like, okay, I'm familiar with this issue. So I thought about going someplace different. Finding a different experience, either in the West Coast. I thought very much about going to Stanford, but ultimately decided that the friends that I had who were at the law school at that time talked about their experience in a way that, while it wasn't perfect, it was very appealing to me.
Mm-hmm. But, well, we're obviously of the same generation, and that 70s generation was very much into journalism as well, because I had a similar kind of feeling about the crusading nature of journalism. Woodward and Bernstein, they brought down a president, all these kinds of things was very, very attractive. So that does sound very familiar, but law is another way of doing that. Did you think of yourself as wanting to change the world? Was that a part of it?
No, I didn't think of myself as wanting to change the world, but I did very much have a view that you can't have any change at all if you don't have a focus, if you don't have the ability to sort of analyze the issue and see both sides of the issue. Mm-hmm. And I was very much influenced in that by the work that my family did, particularly my dad, my dad's a minister and a frustrated lawyer. But he's always been involved in local politics and local issues. And whenever someone has been denied tenure, or particularly minority kids can't get into certain schools, my father has been working on those issues. And so having him show me the importance of focusing on both sides of an issue and finding the right arguments to effect change was effective. And I also saw from that you really make change one case at a time. Mm-hmm. It's great to be able to make policy. That's the ultimate goal. But most of us can still make a great deal of change, one case at a time.
Yeah, yes. So the law school, we were here at a very interesting time.
We were.
In the law school in the 1980s. And for the young people here, law students, I guess everybody thinks the moment that they're any place is the pivotal time. But this was really interesting because the law school was not a very happy place. The faculty, members of the faculty were sort of at odds with one another. The critical legal studies movement was coming into play, and more conservative element of the faculty, they were at loggerheads. I came to law school not knowing really what to expect. Was it what you thought it was going to be when you got there? Did you pay any attention to that? What was your impression of the atmosphere?
I also remember learning about that conflict maybe by my second or third year. But first year, you don't really know what the faculty is doing. They are all knowing, right? They are all powerful in many ways as well. And so you don't really understand the dynamics that are going on. But I remember feeling that there was definitely a lot of tension in the air. The issues when we were in law school, we were not as fortunate as today's students are to have as diverse a faculty as you have. Not to say that there isn't room for improvement, but Derek Bell was tenured, but he was not present at the law school during the 80s. We're the class of '84. He was at NYU,
Clyde Ferguson
was here, but he was very ill.
He was ill. I think he died our second year,
yes,
2L year.
Yes.
And we had no black professors besides Clyde Ferguson. And then Chris Edley came, I think, our 3L year.
Yes.
And Derek Bell came back after that.
Yes.
So it was an interesting
So Charles
moment.
Ogletree, who is everything to so many of us, was still at that time running the public defender's office in Washington, D.C. But he was very active as an alum, and he came back a lot. And I remember being a 3L and working on the Black Alumni Conference that we had every year, and particularly him being very helpful with that. And he was always a resource. But he wasn't a professor, and he wasn't thinking about teaching at that time. He was still a very active practitioner. And we had a petition going at one point to try and to get student support for more diverse faculty, more minorities, and more women. Martha Minow started teaching when we were in law school. And we had a number of people who were visiting professors who ultimately were not given appointments. And so a number of us were very disappointed. In those days, you just didn't really know what the opposition was. And those of you who had Dean Minow, she was a very engaged dean. Dean Vorenberg was not as engaged with students. Mm-hmm. I will say he always met with students. If you asked for a meeting with him, he was responsive, but there was just this opacity to the entire faculty. And then later, as you know, we did learn that there was a lot of tension about what should be the main focus of legal education here at the school, and what should be the role of critical legal studies here at the school. And that was playing out. And to an extent, I really do think, to be very blunt, I think that the students suffered because of that, because you have a better experience in any graduate school if you have an engaged faculty. I mean, the benefit of being at a professional school like Harvard is the breadth of diversity of experience, at least, of the faculty, and the ability to connect with someone who can illuminate your way forward, who can talk about what you might want to focus on or specialize in, and can give you some insight into that. And they were definitely focused on a lot of infighting. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had some people who were still responsive. You know, you could get a meeting and all, but it was a very different experience.
Mm-hmm. It's like anything. There were professors that I had that you would seek them out, and their door would be open. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, there was a general sense of, that there was something going on that was sort of interfering with the atmosphere and changing the atmosphere. I have to say, Loretta, one of the things, we were not in the same section.
Right.
We were not in the same section, and this was in the days when the sections were 140 each. And it changes the whole atmosphere to have it, and people saying, ooh, knocking it down. It makes it, this group of, I have to tell you, this group of students, they are much nicer than we were. Much nicer than we were. We used to hiss each other in class when people said things that you disagreed with, the whole business. It was a
turkey bingo.
Turkey bingo, all kinds of things that were not very nice. But I tell you, the students today are nicer than we were. And maybe it was a fallout from everything that was going on. But it was an interesting moment. Did you have people who talked to you about law school before you came? Did you have a sense of what to expect, in the classes, from the professors and so forth? Because many people don't. Yeah. I would have to say I arrived here I talked to people about classes, my classmates from Dartmouth who'd come here, but not in the same way you did. You had the advantage of a form of mentorship in a way, right?
Well, I did have, because I was here at Harvard College, I did meet law students, black law students who were at the time 1L, 2L when I was a junior and senior, and you would just meet them in different activities, and so that was extremely beneficial to have somebody who had already gone through at least 1 or 2 years sort of walk you through what to expect. Although, it really is, even though I'd been here 4 years in Cambridge, it is still a shock to the system to come here. It absolutely is. And when I was starting law school, I had Professor Miller for civil procedure, Arthur Miller.
Give her the section. Who did you have for your section?
Arthur Miller, Lloyd Weinreb, David Westfall, and I can't remember who else I had. I can't remember who I had for torts. And it was a fairly good group, but they were very different. Mm-hmm. And so you'd get this information sort of generally from a lot of different students about what professors were like. And what we were told about Professor Miller was that the very first case he taught on diversity jurisdiction, because one of the parties was from North Carolina, he would always call on the student from North Carolina in the class.
Ooh.
And that was me that particular year. And so I go in first day. I have read this case backwards and forwards. I don't know what I'm looking at. It seemed a little. It didn't seem that tough to me, actually. I remember,
which is how you know there's a problem.
That there's a problem. And I was like, what exactly is the issue here? And he doesn't call on me. He calls on somebody. He makes a statement about, I'm going to break tradition, and he calls on somebody. And it sort of threw the whole rhythm of the class off, right? Because everyone's sort of laying back, thinking, okay, well, Loretta will fall first, and then it'll be our turn. And it didn't happen that way. Everyone's sort of like, what's he doing? Mm-hmm. But it still can be a shock to the system, because you come here, and particularly, and I enjoyed law school. I enjoyed the critical thinking. I enjoyed, focusing on, as I said before, both sides of the issue. But, you get these interesting questions. I remember when he did finally call on me, we're talking about, diversity jurisdiction. He says, why do you think we have it? And it was another Southern case. And I said, well, part of the reason is going to be that, at this particular time, there still is tension between North and South, even though it's well into the early 20th century. And there's a lot of prejudice against the South. And so you've got to think about how you handle those issues. And I sort of knew that from my experience being a Southerner. Mm-hmm. He said to me, what book did you read that in? Where did you get that from? Did you get that from a nutshell or something? And I said, no, it's obvious. If you have,
you said it's obvious.
well, certain things. I will say the one thing about the law school is that it's a great place. It was a great place for us. But if you came from sort of a different part of the country, mm-hmm. if you came from a different culture, sometimes there was a view that. The Northeastern experience, the Northeastern academic or legal experience is the only one that counts. Mm-hmm. And so when you bring your other worldview to it, and I'm talking as a Southerner who has seen this play out just in life.
Every day.
Yeah. Every day. And so it's sort of like, wow, that's not part of this, sort of erudite academic experience. And so you do get a lot of that, mm-hmm. Both at the law school and the college. So you have to sort of keep pretty grounded and keep an eye on where your roots are, because there's a larger world than Harvard Law School. Uh-huh.
What was the most surprising thing about it?
I think the most surprising thing about it was to me was probably, even though I knew people would be intense, mm-hmm. was how intense some people were. And just to the point of, and I will say that when some of my older friends, people who were ahead of me, said to me, sometimes you're going to go in the library looking for a book. Yes, we had to use books in those days.
There's these things. They have paper in them.
And you're going to look for the seminal case being discussed, and someone will have ripped the pages out before you got there. I thought, oh, come on. This is the paper chase. This is sort of like, anecdotal.
Had you read that
stuff
before you came?
I think I did read that. Yeah. I think I did read that. And then I actually had that happen to me. I actually was in the library just doing some general research, looking for a particular case that was a seminal case mm-hmm. in a particular field, and it had been ripped out of the book. And I remember thinking, really, people? Really? It's this level of intensity, I think, comes from the fear that you all have in a new environment. We all have it. The fear of not being successful in this new environment, that you have to hold on to everything.
And it's such the intensity is that it's a group of people. All of the people who are here are people who are used to being,
sure,
the best, or patted on the head and everything, and then you come to this place. And my husband and I, for many people, it's like Green Star time. You remember when you were growing up, they had the Gold Star and the Red Star and the Green Star, and this is like Green Star time. You've learned that people learn that they're not as brilliant as they think they are. Mm-hmm. There are many people who's always somebody who's going to be ahead of you, and so any kind of way that you can get mm-hmm. Get the jump on people, you do. Of course, now you can't cut pages out anymore. None of that is relevant, fortunately. So the competitiveness of it is. What did you like the most about it? You said you like the classes, but in terms of your classmates,
I like the camaraderie. I was fortunate enough to make.
Did you do a study group?
So I did. I did 2 different study groups first year, 2, maybe even 3, mm-hmm. And made friends who are friends of my heart today. Mm-hmm. The support that I got from the friends that I made in law school was tremendous, and just a different perspective from people from different parts of the country, and who were sort of seeing it through a slightly different lens than I was eye-opening mm-hmm. to me. And so that was helpful, and to talk things through with people and work through to a conclusion, which is something that you end up doing very much as a prosecutor, actually. Mm-hmm. It's very much a collaborative kind mm-hmm. of effort that goes on between your colleagues and the agents with whom you work. And so sort of working through those issues was very, very helpful for me. But you have to sort of decide for yourself on a lot of things. There were things that happened in law school. And you and I were talking about, my first year criminal law class, and we're criminal procedure, and we're studying jury selection, and we're studying Batson challenges in particular, and the rise of the use of race as a consideration for the courts, both appellate and the Supreme Court, as they considered cases. And then there was a time when there was no such thing as Batson, believe it or not, and you could have wildly improper jury selection going on that was never challenged. And there was this case that we had. It was a black man convicted of raping a white woman, and on fairly skimpy evidence. And there was some serious issues about jury selection. That was what we were studying in the case. And I remember raising my hand in class, and we had been talking about this issue, and I asked the professor, I said, well, why do you think that in this particular case, the court in its decision did not deal with the racial issues in this case? And I remember my professor saying to me, there are no racial issues in this case. This is a case purely about jury selection and what questions are proper or improper. And it doesn't have anything to do with the race of the defendant or the victim. And I just thought, what? And so you can spit. And this is a great school, and I've learned a lot. But you can get your head in the clouds here a lot, and sort of forget that the law is about real people, and particularly in criminal law, as I ultimately came to work in that field. But the cases about criminal law and procedure are going to be fairly serious because they're going to involve constitutional issues. And every case is a life. But it was just sort of this academic exercise. And I just thought, there's a disconnect here between how I see the world and how this is being played back to me. And we were always told, go sit down, go visit your professors.
That's what you're supposed to do.
Go visit your professor and go talk to them. And this really did trouble me. And I remember going to talk to this professor, who was always very open. Always would make appointments with you, and was very generous with his time. We were talking about this, and I said, I just want to go over this. I said, I really didn't understand the point you were making in class. I didn't get it. To me, this case has obvious racial implications for a host of reasons. And he said, well, I'm viewing it academically. And I just thought, if you're the defendant in a case like this, or if you're the victim in a case like this is not academic. But we had the discussion, and finally, I remember he said to me, well, do all the black students feel this way? And I thought, well, I don't know. I'm just talking to you. And I have not done a poll. And I said, I don't know. I just need some help understanding how you're viewing this and why, my way of viewing it doesn't seem to be the way that's going to get the grade, frankly. And so we keep talking, and he made a point about something else, and I said, well, do all the white professors here view it that way? And he literally went, he jumped back, and to his credit, he said, okay, I get it. I get it. I see what you're saying here. So there were moments when, you're talking with someone who comes from a totally different background, totally different perspective of the law, and totally different way of looking at the law, where you could make that connection. And that, to me, was always very rewarding. But it was difficult at times to have that with every professor or on every issue.
Well, I think we've grown a lot in that way. I think there's still complaints about not discussing race enough in classes where it's obviously something. I teach criminal procedure, and there's no way to teach criminal procedure without race being a part of it. I can't imagine anybody doing that. But at the time that we were here, I could see people feeling who didn't have the experiences and didn't understand it now. And with the students who speak up about these kinds of things, because you have to do a lot of educating, quite frankly. Yeah. I mean, that's a burden that African American students have, and sometimes African American faculty have, or any places where you're going where there are not that many black people, to sort of point these things out. And it's really good that you went to talk to him, because you probably you probably helped another generation of people, another group of students, because he would think differently about it after having that kind of conversation. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times how the law school helped you as a prosecutor, but that's not how you started out. First, did you think of going to a law firm when you came to law school? Was that what you had in mind to do?
I was not sure, because again, I was thinking more about communications, First Amendment, or some kind of journalistic opportunity. And so that would be either a law firm, possibly a regulatory institution, something to do with that. I really didn't know that much about the world of what lawyers did, other than what I'd seen growing up. And it was, you know, the litigation of my area in North Carolina, and, you know, always being aware of civil rights law in particular, because I was fortunate enough to be from the same state as Julius Chambers, who was a huge leader in civil rights work and was revered in North Carolina, and so saw those important issues. But, you know, I didn't really know, and I will say that one of the advantages that I hope students have now is seeing the different opportunities that there are in law. And seeing the different options that you, in fact, do have. So when we were in law school, there were very few paths that were open to us. Now, I was also fortunate enough to be on the Legal Aid Bureau for a year, and so spent a lot of time with people who were thinking about public interest work even then. But it was difficult, frankly, if you couldn't afford it. There were very few public interest fellowships or scholarships at that time. It's much better now. But going directly into public interest was a choice everyone could not afford to make, even if people were incredibly committed to it. And that was just one of the realities of the practice at that time. So I did have exposure to that, and was considered myself very lucky to do that. But it was, you either went to a law firm or you clerked. Or you might have done some public interest work. People didn't get a lot of LLMs at that time either. Now people are focusing more on that. And the SJD students, you know, you come back and do that. But it was pretty much, you know, we were all kind of tracked into law firm life, which was interesting. Tracked
because one of the charges that students have is that the law school pushes people towards law firms. And I remember my class, my sections, first year, Abe Chase, Dershowitz, Duncan Kennedy, and Charlie Donahue. And after, Charlie Donahue, yes, he's still there. Charlie Donahue, they kind of were not so thrilled about firm work. I mean, they were pushing us or telling us that being a, you know, public service, not necessarily public interest, you know, but government work, that was the thing to do. So they always acted disappointed if people talked about. So I didn't feel that I was tracked, but it may be that just because there's so many more jobs, as you're suggesting, so many more jobs in those places, it's an easy thing to do, that a lot of people went into it. So it was, I mean, I sort of stumbled into that. I certainly didn't come to Harvard Law School thinking that I was going to go to a law firm, because I didn't know about the world of law firms other than, you know, in a very superficial kind of way. So, it's, even if it's not...
Nor could we have predicted the world of law firms.
No, we could not have predicted the world of law firms. That was something that was a completely different place. And we ended up at the same place.
Sure.
Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell, which, if I'm recalling, that year had a huge class of Black associates. I think there were like 6 of us or something, which for that time period was large. How did you choose Cahill?
I chose Cahill because of their First Amendment practice and their strong litigation practice. I wanted something that would give me litigation, but also in general.
You hadn't been a summer associate there, though.
I
was a summer associate there.
Yeah, I did a summer there.
So the First Amendment, Floyd and Deb and those people that you were going to work with, I did a little bit of work with them as well. But that's their, you know, that's what they're known for. Yeah, and so that's why you chose it.
Yes, although you know that that's not everyone goes there for that, and so you know that you're not going to be doing that 100%. And will you be the chosen one? And get to work on a case with Floyd, who was great, and was a great teacher and a great instructor. But I would say that the dynamic at that time, certainly in the 80s, was that law firms, particularly in New York, but all the big cities, were talking a lot more about diversity than they ever had before. And there was a push to bring more, particularly young Black associates, into firms. But I think because they were really at the first stage of that, once they got a large number of black associates, or even a large number of women associates, they didn't really know what to do with us. And that's
when you say they didn't know what to do with us.
That's been the problem with law firms, I think, throughout, and I think it continues to be a problem with firms. It's just this perception that if you want to change the face of the legal profession, which people were professing to do at that time, we'll hire a bunch of people, drop them in this mix with everybody else, and then sort of let them fend for themselves or leave them alone. And what would happen was, because people were so concerned about interacting with you in the quote-unquote wrong way, they wouldn't interact with you at all. Yeah. And in a law firm, interaction is everything.
Yes,
that's how you learn.
Exactly, that's how you learn. I remember going to Houston for some depositions and coming back after things were over, around 6 or 7 o'clock, and we were supposed to go to dinner afterwards, and it was just me and this other associate. And we got to the door of the restaurant, and then he said, there's the Four Seasons. He said, I think I'll just go upstairs and order room service, and you can do the same. And I remember thinking, he doesn't want to go to dinner without people knowing that we are professional, that like going out to dinner with a black woman, like we were on a date or something. And I think he was uncomfortable with that. And you think, well, here's a moment where you can't go sit down with somebody after something's over and say, so why do you ask this question? What was this about? What you can't learn in those kind of informal settings because people are uncomfortable in that kind of situation. If I'd been, I would imagine, a white guy, or even a white woman necessarily, because it wouldn't have seen as strange to people. And so if you think about when you say putting people in and just letting them fend for themselves, you're not thinking about the dynamics of race in the country overall, and understanding how those kinds of things will shape people's behavior.
But also the dynamics of gender. Because I don't know that he would have sat down with a young white woman either. I mean, I remember also at our firm, there were some people who were clearly marked for partnership track, and it was at a time when they had just started hiring huge associate classes. It was clear that everyone they hired, 40 people a year, were never going to stay and make partner. But ahead of you, several years ahead of you, as you looked to senior people, you could see the associates who were doing well, who were thought well of, who were definitely on partnership track. And I remember one of the young women litigation associates who was really doing well and was also just a wonderful person. And when she had her first child and came back from maternity leave, she wanted to work part-time for a period. And it almost split the firm. I mean, the discussions and the committees and the meetings, it took them months to decide if that meant she was still committed to the practice of law. And I will say that was an instructive moment for me as a young woman, and one that I actually thought of a lot later on when I became a manager in the U.S. Attorney's Office and had to deal with the same issue of managing people who needed to also make time for their families. I remember thinking at that time, because Kale it's a great firm, it still is a great firm, but like every firm, you work hard. And you don't want to answer your phone at 5 o'clock on a Friday because you're going to be there all weekend and all this, that, and all. And I remember thinking, if she wants to continue working in this environment after having produced the most important person in her life, of course she's committed to this firm. I mean, it's to me, it's also all how you look at it. And so that stuck with me as something that the law as a field has trouble with, in large part because law is a reactionary field. Yes. People come to you with a problem, people come to you with an issue. Unless you are really a true counselor, often in the corporate world, you're not really proactive about seeking out issues. You try and point them out for your clients. But for the most part, the law is reactive. And that mindset, I think, makes it very hard for the law to change on these issues of gender and racial and ethnic diversity, because it's the way we've always done things. And unless someone brings it to you, as is now happening and began to happen when we were at our firm, clients begin to demand it. You don't see a lot of change in law firms. And so, and also when we were in a law firm, the profession was changing very much.
Absolutely,
also.
absolutely. Yes, yes. I mean, we noted the huge classes. I was talking to her earlier about being on a deal at Cahill and seeing the old routing slips that they had with the names on them, names of associates and names of partners. And virtually everybody at this earlier moment who had been an associate had made it to partnership. And that's a very different model when you hire people with the expectation that you're going to train them. And then it's important to the client, because the client knows that you have hired, this person may be their lawyer later on.
For
so
years.
It makes a big difference in the way you're treated versus being brought in pretty much as fodder, as you could say, to be throwing at cases and billing hours and so forth. It's a very, very different experience for people. And it's not that we didn't get anything out of it. You get a high salary for a few years. You get to pay your loans back. You get to live relatively well and whatever, or save money or not. But it's a quid pro quo for that. They own you for a time, and you get a lot of money. But it's not. It's law really much as a business. Now, I have to say, as a legal historian, people have been saying that law is no longer a profession and has become a business since the 1790s. So it's a recurring theme, like older people talking about the young generation. But this is the 80s were really, really different. The rise of leveraged buyouts, of financial institutions, investment banking taking off. At Cahill, we did Drexel. They were a client, and Mike Milken and all those crew of people. And this was a moment when lawyers apparently got sort of jealous of the people who were there, the investment bankers. We'd go home at, they'd go home at midnight and we'd be there until 2 a.m. in the morning, and they'd be making 3 times as much money. And that's when a lot of lawyers started thinking that I'm leaving to law and going to financial houses. And so it was the 80s were a big deal too. I mean, not just in law schools. It was sort of a pivotal point in the legal education, the legal profession overall.
I think that's absolutely true, and certainly the shift to the business model was probably more stark in that time period. But you still saw the expansion of associate classes, at least at the big New York and other large city firms. And then I saw, and I think we're still seeing another shift in the profession, which is the outsourcing of legal work. That is diminishing sort of the training ground that used to be the province of young associates in firms is being outsourced, in large part for client considerations of cost. When I ultimately was a partner in the 2000s, that was a big issue there, and we began to use contract lawyers more and more. And so that model is shifting even more. And so as I look back on that, I think the takeaway is that I still think the law is a wonderful profession. I think it is, for me, a profession that truly can be transformative. But I do think that for every lawyer, at every stage in your career, it's important to realize that you're investing a lot of yourself into whatever model you're in, and make sure that you're also getting something out of it. And I think people are often surprised at how transferable the skills are that you learn in one model to another. Because again, law is reactionary and it's very traditional. I think people tend to have a lot of fear about change, about changing what they do and how they do it. And so I would see that at the firm too, people who sort of were unhappy, or people at different firms also. You start having lunch with different people in your class at different firms, and people who were just so unhappy at their firms. And I would think to myself, well, then why are you still there? It is just not worth this level of psychic angst. When you're not getting anything out of it but really negativity, you've got to realize that what law school is giving, or certainly should be giving to all of us, is the ability to manage the way in which we think and process information and guide others. And see issues and look around the corner and see things, and that is something that you can pick up and move from model to model as your profession changes. But when it happens, when it starts happening, and you don't understand it, it can be scary.
Yeah. So what's with all this prosecutor business? You were a defense attorney there with me, defending, albeit companies, powerful companies. How did you decide to switch gears and go over to the dark side?
I prefer to think of it as moving into the light, but I take your meaning. It's an interesting choice to become a prosecutor, I think. And for me, it was a perfect fit right away. But you never know when you make that move. And I talked to people about it, and people who had been both state prosecutors as well as federal prosecutors. And I wanted to do my own trials. I wanted to run my own cases. I wanted to do the investigations. I like the part about putting the pieces of the puzzle together. But for me, the prosecutorial angle was about playing an active role in both cases and policy that were going to protect people. And I think that I've always felt that when you look at society, you can tell what a society values by what and whom they protect. And so you can look at the criminal justice system and get a blueprint for how people value certain types of victims, certain types of crimes, certain types of activity. And I've always felt that as tangled and difficult a relationship that the minority community has and still has with law enforcement, that community deserves to be protected just like any other community, maybe even more so. And truly protected in a way that is organic and part of the community, as opposed to the whole sort of occupying force that goes on. And so, I had a view that I wanted to work on those issues. I wanted to do that, and I wanted to go to court, and I wanted to do trials and have fun. Which for me, when I was in law school, I did a mock trial moot court. I did a criminal law moot court that was just amazing. I loved every minute of that, and remembered that experience. And at Cahill, I was fortunate enough to work on a few small cases that either went to hearings or trials. And you're watching the partner up there thinking, I wouldn't ask that question. I wouldn't do that.
I wouldn't do that.
And so,
that doesn't make any sense.
And talking to people who had made that leap and being able to do that was, when I finally made the move, it was a tremendous privilege to me. And partly also because when you go into government, you're in a situation where, unlike at a law firm, everyone has got to work flat out. It's harder to ignore different people. When you need everybody on deck. At a law firm, they can kind of shuffle you around and move you around, but certainly in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you were given a case and you had to run with it. And I chose an office that, although it didn't have a large number of minorities, there were only 2 other black AUSAs at the time. There were a lot of women in the Brooklyn U.S. Attorney's Office, and a lot of them in supervisory positions. And so that told me that if you proved yourself and if you did well, that you could move forward. And
that's so important to look, if you're looking for a job, looking at anything, look at who is advanced, how people are advanced, and who gets advanced, and that tells you a lot about the institution. So what was the most difficult thing to get used to coming from the firm? You talk about all the nice things, the great things. You get to do cases, ask questions.
The 65% pay cut was not fun.
Okay, yeah.
The hardest thing was telling my parents that's what I was going to do.
Oh, really? Oh, really? So
having them go, you're going to do, and then particularly when I told them, and I'm so excited about it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to work on criminal cases, and I think my mother was like, and so what's the salary? And I shared that with her, and then of course I had a friend in the office, and I rather excitedly told them how she'd been in the office only a few years, and one of her disgruntled witnesses had tried to kill her. And
well, you were prosecuting gangsters, the gang members. And
so that was it was tough because you've got expectations. You've got expectations. If you don't come from a family that has a long legal tradition of other lawyers, you're sort of it. And you go to Harvard and you're on Wall Street, and this. And for all of us, I think it's you want to make your family proud of you. There's nothing wrong with that. You want to make them happy, and it's great for them to feel great about what you do. But ultimately, it's your life, and it is your career, and it's your time, and it's your energy. And my family was always very supportive of that, although I do remember the night before I was going to start working at the U.S. Attorney's Office, my father called me up and said, you know, I bet you if you called your old firm, they would take you back. They really liked you, and I bet you they would take you back. And I remember saying to him, look, you sent me to Harvard College and Harvard Law School and to Wall Street, which is frankly something that I don't know that they envisioned their middle child doing, you know, in the 50s when I was born. And I said, but if at the end of the day of all of that, there's only one thing that I can do, then I really have wasted my time. And so I would say that to everybody, you know, whether you're a student or an alum, whether you're changing your career, whether you love your career or not, if you've been fortunate enough to go to this institution or any great law school, there is so much that you can do, and it is so easy to think that there's only one thing that I can do. Yeah. You know, this path is comfortable, it's familiar, it's well-trod, and it may be the path for you. It very well may be, but I always urge people to, when something comes along that really grabs you and really touches you, take that leap. Mm-hmm. You know, you've at least once in your career, take that leap, because it will change you. Mm-hmm. It'll change you in ways that you will never imagine at the time. Mm-hmm. And maybe it won't work out the way that you think it will. You know, I mean, I didn't go to the U.S. Attorney's Office thinking, my plan was not to become the U.S. Attorney. You know, I did not know that was going to be my path when I got there. Mm-hmm. But it was a path that opened up for me. Yeah. And I was able to keep walking on that path.
Because nobody's done it.
Yeah.
Nobody's done it besides, I guess it was Jefferson's U.S. attorney who started out as U.S. attorney, became attorney general, but you worked your way up. So you can't have sort of planned that this is what I'm going to do, because it wasn't a path that
there was no path for it. But I took the leap. And the best things that have come to me, frankly, have been when I've taken that leap. When someone said, you know, I'm going to give you this case and I want you to try it. Mm-hmm. And you say, okay, you're just going to run with that. When someone called me up and said, do you want to come to Tanzania and teach in a war crimes tribunal with me? And you say, okay, I'm going to run with that. Mm-hmm. And you've got to take that leap. Yeah, you really do.
One of my professors, Professor Horowitz, who said that people who come to Harvard Law School and Harvard schools like that very often think that there is only one thing that they can do. There, in some ways, the people who have the most choices, the best opportunities, limit themselves, saying there's only a few things we can do because they're staying on that path.
It can be scary to get off the path of success. Mm-hmm. It can be. Mm-hmm. It can be, but you can't predict success.
You can't predict success. And coming to a place like this and the schools that you've gone to, it opens doors. It may not work the way you want it to do, but you have the flexibility to try something else. So, the U.S. attorney, you go back into private practice, you're called back into office again, another public service, and then you go to the Justice Department. Well, you're part of the Justice Department there, but what does the Justice Department mean to you as an institution? What do you think it means to the country?
You know, I think, having been in and out of justice since 1990, when I first joined the office, and I was tremendously proud to be an AUSA, and still think that is probably the best job in the Department of Justice. Although Attorney General is pretty good, it really is. It really is pretty good.
She could call up and get a reservation anywhere. Just have to worry about anything.
But that ability to touch people's lives. You know, and I felt tremendously lucky, and although, again, it terrified my parents, I did start out working on...
It terrified your parents?
I worked on a lot of violent crime cases. Yeah. And I worked on a lot of cases that involved witness tampering and threats. I was never threatened. I feel very fortunate. I was not. Some of my friends were, some of my colleagues were, but I did not have that experience. But to be able to talk to someone who's been touched by particularly organized crime violence, or gang violence, you know, something that just kind of hits out of the blue, and be able to sort of bring some measure of justice to them, or at least let them know what happened and why this tragedy has hit their family, is really gratifying. And so I always had this view that the Department of Justice could touch real lives. And then, of course, obviously from the importance of the civil rights movement to my own family, and just my father revering how justice had come in and supported that movement in the 60s, the importance of it then. And so I think, and even as Attorney General, you know, I would talk to people around the country about cases and get requests, you know, for help. You know, we have this terrible issue with police brutality or police violence, and we need DOJ's help. We're having a terrible environmental spill. You know, in the early part of the Obama administration, the Department of Justice did tremendous work resolving that in terms of trying to provide real help to the Gulf Coast. So people look at the Department of Justice and they lean on it. They lean on it, and that means a lot to me. It always has. They view us almost as the place of last resort, where you can go and get help. And you know, I would look at the letters I would get sometimes, both as U.S. Attorney and as Attorney General, from people who just wanted help. They just wanted some fairness. They wanted to see fairness in a system, and to be able to first of all, to have them trust you with that issue or that pain or their story means a great deal. And I think it should mean a great deal if you're going to work at DOJ. And to be able to try and use the law in a way that's actually going to effectuate positive change. So for me, the department, as you can tell, it means a lot to me. As I've often said, it's the only cabinet agency named for an ideal. And that makes it different to me. It makes it special to me. It means living up to that name is more than just, you know, coming in and marking up documents. It is coming in with a mindset that what I'm going to do is going to move the arc of the universe, you know, towards justice in some way. And when I look back on the work of the department over the years, it has done that. It has done that. But I will say that it hasn't always been that bulwark for everyone. It hasn't always been that source of comfort or that refuge for everyone. And I think that is part of the challenge of the department. It's part of the challenge of government writ large. It's part of the challenge that we're facing, and we faced it at various times in this country. I think we're very much facing it now. And so those of us who love the department and have been there, or people who lean on the department, I think can still take lessons from what DOJ means, you know, and use that to continue the work that has always been an important part of moving towards equality in this country. If you look back at many of, frankly, most of the desegregation cases involving schools, and that wasn't the department, that was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You know, if you look at a lot of cases involving the advancement of immigrant rights, that hasn't always been the department. It may have been MALDEF, you know, or other advocacy groups who do impact litigation. And so they're tremendous partners for the department. But when there are times when, for whatever the reason, whether it's who's in a particular chair or the policies that are adopted, the department is not going to be that last best refuge. I think it's important to remember that the message of the Department of Justice is we can all play a part in its work. You know, we can all have a role to play. We all do have a role to play in equality and justice and moving that needle further.
Before we start to talk about the Justice Department today, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about being a manager. Have you always wanted to be, this is different being a litigator, a lawyer, and being a manager. What do you like about being a manager, and what are the problems being a manager? Do you think you're a good one? You obviously are a good one. But.
I was surprised how much I liked management. You know, when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you made your bones doing trials. You know, you had your big case, and you know, I worked on you know, Asian organized crime cases and corruption cases, and was fortunate enough to work on the Luema case, which was definitely one that changed my life and perspective in many ways. But I had been asked to be a manager, sort of in the midpoint of my career, and initially thought, first of all, you know, I'm going to lose all my friends in the office. But I thought it was a challenge, and I thought, I'll try this, I'll take this. And I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed then and enjoy now helping other young lawyers be the best litigator that they can be. You know, helping someone craft a trial strategy was very rewarding for me. And so I did some teaching. I taught a lot of trial advocacy work for the department. Did a semester at St. John's Law School teaching trial advocacy, taught at the tribunal, and really, really enjoyed that, and found that I enjoyed it a lot. And I always thought that the best tools for me as a manager were remembering the difficult managers I had had. And as I mentioned earlier, thinking back to that experience that we had at Cahill, when this rising star of a young litigator found her very integrity as a lawyer being questioned because she wanted to work part-time, I thought was stunning to me. It shouldn't have been at the time. That was very much the world view of it. And so when I became a manager and had to deal with those issues, I decided to take the view that everyone's got something to contribute to this organization. And it's going to change over time, how much you can contribute and what you can contribute, but everyone's got something to contribute. And I did and do believe that, in particularly whether it's the mother or the father who needs parental leave, if you are going to leave the most precious thing in the world behind and continue to do the very, very difficult work that I required of you as an AUSA, then you were committed. You were committed to the office, and that should be rewarded. And as a manager, it's my job to figure out how to make that work. It shouldn't be your job to figure out how to change the institution around you. It should be the institution's job to hear what you need and use those needs to continue to get the best out of you and strengthen the institution. And that was also influenced a lot by Cahill. Cahill's a great firm, but they're managed, at least when we were there, if you remember, the style was you were brought in as an associate and you had to run around and get your work. You had to run around and meet partners and ask to be on their teams and get there and get work. And I remember thinking, so you're taking the people with the least knowledge, the least experience, and asking them to essentially decide who's going to work on the most important cases within this firm. It just did not, it seemed a little backwards to me.
Well, it seemed backwards, and it seemed attractive actually at the time because you're sort of like a freelance person. But as an individual who's trying to, you think about mentorship, learning, all those kinds of things, I think it's probably better to start it out with a group of people who can guide you doing things.
Everyone needs a template.
Everybody needs a template. And
everyone needs a template.
And when you get to be a manager, you can figure out how not to do those kinds of things, to do things to make it better. So I want to ask you about the Justice Department today. Because as happy as I was to have you as the Attorney General, I was equally upset when you were no longer the Attorney General. I remember sitting on an airplane and a friend of mine texted me to say that there was a new Attorney General, and I started crying. I know everybody on the plane thought I was crazy, and I couldn't say, there's a new Attorney General. Your thoughts about where we are now, and where you would hope to see the department go in the future?
Well, I think my hopes for the department, I tried to work on while I was there, and I think, look, the department is clearly a very different place than when I was there, because it's a different administration. Every administration gets to pick their priorities, what's important to them, and they get to implement them. I've seen that over the course of my career. I think this is one of the more stark examples of change. I personally find it disappointing that in so many ways the main policy seems to be what can we erase as opposed to what can we create. I don't find that a healthy management style or management tool because of what it does to an organization overall, regardless of what's being erased or who's being erased. But I will say that we have to accept that elections have consequences, and there are going to be changes, even in an institution that we hold in the regard that I hold the Department of Justice. And I think for me, I come to that because I've been through transition before. I left my first time as U.S. Attorney at the end of the Clinton administration, and at the beginning of the Bush administration, there was talk. There had been this tradition in New York that the New York U.S. attorneys would stay on even if the administration turned over, if you hadn't finished your term. But the Bush administration didn't want to do that, which is also, again, perfectly appropriate. It's not an unusual thing as well. And so I've seen the departure of one group and the incoming views of people who have a different perspective on things. And what I took from that then is what I take now, and what I often share with people who are still either in the department or who've moved on, which is that you never really leave the Department of Justice, or it certainly never leaves you. And leaving an administration, all that means is you take it with you wherever you go. And one of the reasons that we're all there is, in fact, to learn and to gather information and to make changes, but also to spread that change. It really is to spread that change into the next place or places that we may find ourselves. Because administrations live on in that way, and legacies live on in that way. So I think that even though I think the department, I think they've continued some things. Their focus on violent crime that was consistent with what we were doing before.
Oh, they're continuing with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not new for the department to prosecute violent crime. It's not new. I'm delighted that they're sending help to Iowa to prosecute the murder of the young transgender teenager there. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of a case-by-case thing. And one thing I have learned as a manager is that individual cases do not a policy make. Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about the department as a whole, you do have to think about the policies because you want things to fit in with a certain framework. And so, I would always say, and when people would ask me, what do you want to tell the new people coming in? It's like, it's not my place to tell you how to run the department. But what I would say to anybody moving into any new situation is look at what's worked in the past, but most importantly, look at what has not worked in the past. And in particular, as we look at this return to a focus on sort of a narrow focus on mandatory minimum sentences and going for the harshest penalty and not having a view that we have any responsibility to adjudicate a case based on the individual defendants, look at how that has worked out in the past, because it has not worked out well. And it hasn't worked out well for those individual defendants and their families and their communities, but it hasn't worked out well for the country. We've removed swaths of young people, mostly young men of color, from communities when they're needed the most. We've pulled them out of the job market from communities that need that energy. There are people who try and calculate the loss to GDP of removing that number of adults from the economy. And so it hurts the country as a whole, and it doesn't necessarily make us safer, depending upon the nature of the crime and the people that you are incarcerating. And I'm an aggressive prosecutor. I believe in holding people accountable. I've never had a problem with harsh sentences when they are called for, when they are accounted for. But I also know that as we look at certain issues, a lot of how we view them gets played out within the criminal justice arena. I'm tremendously gratified that we're continuing to focus on the opioid crisis and view it as the public health menace that it is. This is a tremendous, tremendous problem. But so was crack 20 years ago. It was almost the same template, and yet we viewed that from a purely law enforcement lens, and we missed out on opportunities to deal with that problem in ways that would have helped more people than we harmed. You can hold people accountable, but you can also take into consideration the public health issues that are coming about from these epidemics, so to speak. And so we've missed that opportunity. Going back to policies of those missed opportunities, to me, I don't think is going to be productive. So my view has always been look at what worked, but look at what doesn't work, and be prepared to admit what didn't work and look for new ways and try and move forward.
So before we go to questions from the audience, what's next for you? What would you like to do? You were talking about choices, and you have all these choices and do all these kinds of things.
Well, one of the things I have not landed on an issue. I've just been taking this last year and spending time with my family and reconnecting with them and taking a break, but also thinking about these issues. And it's very important to me to continue to speak on the fact that the work that we did in the department has not died. It's going to be handled in a very different way. That is true, yes. But there are people with whom we worked, there are people on whose behalf we advocated who never thought they had a friend in Washington, never thought they had a friend at the Department of Justice, and now they know that that's possible. They know that they deserve that, and they know that they, in fact, can speak, and they do have a voice.
And so you reach out to those communities.
And I do, because people have a voice. Yeah. And I think that it's important to work on those issues. If, in fact, policies are going to be different, it doesn't mean that all work stops. So I do want to continue speaking on those issues and working with communities, particularly on issues of law enforcement relations. We did a lot of work in that, empowering communities and also strengthening law enforcement agencies that wanted to have better community police relations.
So that's your main, that could be your main focus.
We shall see.
We'll see.
We shall see.
Okay. We'd like to hear from people in the audience.
So there's to your left, there's a gentleman whose hand has been up for a while.
Hi there. I'm a big fan of yours, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Can people hear him? He's got a mic. I should have said that. There will be a mic.
Speaking to the mic. Repeating, I'm a big fan of yours, and thank you for being here today. Many lawyers in our country are in pain because in January of this year, we had leaders in the Department of Justice, 2 women, each of which had great honor, Sally Yates being your assistant. Now we find ourselves without people, those people in the Department of Justice, and we look around for people with honor in the Department of Justice, and we're having a hard time finding them. I would like for you to speak to the students about how to keep your honor as you go through your legal career, because it is an easy thing to lose. It's hard to maintain, and I assume your father being a minister and your mother being a librarian instilled in you honor, but did law school give you any, or was it a constant fight?
Well, I think that law school is a different kind of test of your honor, because again, you're learning, you're growing, you're expanding your mind, and so as you take in new ideas, you have to make sure that you're doing them consistent with your own moral code, so to speak, in terms of what you want to pursue after law school, what activities you want to do here. Look, I think that there are still, in my view, and based on my knowledge, that core group of career people at the Department of Justice who keep that ship running. And I know that many of them have had to give a great deal of thought also about whether or not the policies that they're going to be implementing now are consistent with what they can do. And as I've always said to people in that situation, that's a very personal decision. I can't advise you to leave or not leave, but a number of people were facing that issue and had that concern. What I say is to people is that it matters that you are there. It matters that people are present within an organization that do hold fast to that organization's core ideals and core principles. And whether or not you're going to be in a situation where you're asked to go against them will depend very, very much on your role in that organization. Some people may feel that any role in an organization where the policies are different from yours is something that they can't do. I respect that. Some people may feel that in an organization where, by the very nature of the turn of the political wheel, leadership changes over the course of time, that they can, in fact, still do a lot of good within an organization at the career level. And people have done a great deal of good and will continue to do a great deal of good at the career level. But everyone's got to sort of find that for themselves. As you go through your careers, you will see the markers that are important to you. When you're just starting out, learn as much as possible, try as much as possible, do as many different types of things as possible, experience the great variety of law. And some things are going to fall by the wayside by interest, and some of them are going to fall by the wayside because you may say, look, I think it's a wonderful thing to keep the engine of corporate America going, but it may not be consistent with your values, in which case you now know what you don't want to do. and you can move into an area that is more consistent with those values. You may feel that working on the engine of corporate America is important because you want to bring a certain sense of ethics to that particular struggle. You want to ultimately work in a corporate America that does think about diversity and does think about issues like sustainability and ethical behavior, and you want to be a part of that, and that's also good. But you will have seen that from doing different types of legal work early in your career. And so I think that you can work in a number of different environments and maintain your honor as long as you feel that your efforts are going to help that organization. There may come a time in any organization when you no longer have that view, in which case it is time to make a move. It is time to find the venue that will let you express yourself in a way that's consistent with your ideals.
Here, please.
I appreciate that, those comments very much. That was actually the first part of the question I was going to ask, but I'll ask the second part, which is, can you specifically address how you would speak to a student who's wondering whether they should, in turn, apply to the honors program to this Department of Justice specifically?
Mm-hmm. I think you have to look at it based upon what you're looking to gain from that program. In the honors program, certainly at that level, at the internship level, at the honors program level, it is really about not just skills, but also sort of learning what the department stands for. And as I mentioned before, the Department of Justice, there's over 110,000 people who work for the Department of Justice, most of whom stay year after year, administration after administration. And so, you may find that there's a place, a student may find there's a place for them in the department exploring, how to handle difficult environmental cases, exploring how to handle difficult antitrust cases. It may be that you have an internship in a U.S. Attorney's Office where you see, what it means to actually build a criminal case and protect people. And a lot of that is not dependent upon who's at the head of the particular ship. So I encourage people to look into those opportunities still. But I respect someone who says that, look, if there's a particular issue that is so important to them that they don't think that the department's the place for them right now, I respect that also. But what I would say is look at it more from the fact that this is an institution that began enforcing the anti-Klan laws. That's how the Department of Justice really started to grow in the late 1800s, and that's what it did. And this is a Department of Justice that essentially tried to work on the trust-busting cases and has been a force for environmental good and is still an important force in terms of national security and terrorism, and that there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be gained, so that if an institution were to change leadership and it's a place where you might want to move up in that institution, you would have those skills and you would have the knowledge of the institution and be prepared to do so. I have often said that law enforcement is more than who the Attorney General is. As important a job as it is, and it's an important job, and as wonderful a job as it is, and I loved it. I loved being the Attorney General. Law enforcement is more than who the Attorney General is. It's what people expect from law enforcement. It's what they demand from law enforcement. It's what lawyers expect and demand in that arena and in that world also. So I think I would urge students to look at the department as being a multifaceted organization that needs people who believe in its ideals and who will be there regardless of the turn of the political wheel to carry those ideals forward.
Yeah.
You were involved in a very consequential decision involving the Hillary Clinton investigation. And you had some tough decisions to make. And during the latter part of the campaign, the FBI director, who reports to the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General, made a rather unique decision to reopen an investigation based on evidence which apparently did not exist. Could you tell us the difficulties you had in dealing with this whole set of issues, your decision to recuse yourself, the role of the Deputy Attorney General, and relating to Mr. Comey's decision, because we face in part the consequence of some of those actions with the election that may have, so I know it was a difficult set of decisions for you. Perhaps you could discuss your role and your decision.
So I can discuss some of that. I will say that a number of bodies, including the Department's Inspector General, are still doing a review of the email investigation from a number of different facets, and so I don't talk about a lot of things while there's an ongoing review or investigation. But what I can say is that what our goal was at the beginning of the case and throughout the email investigation was to handle it like every other investigation, independently, with a focus on looking at the facts, looking at the evidence, and coming to the correct legal conclusion. And ultimately, that was done. I do think that the noise of a lot of other issues obscured that in many, many ways. One of my concerns was how that impacted the team of career prosecutors and agents who worked on that, who just worked day and night, dedicated themselves to that. And so I'm not able to go into a lot of the decision making that we did at the time right now. I'm not able to go into sort of, the behind the scenes things at this moment. But I feel that whenever you're facing a difficult decision, it's best to outline the principles by which you're going to make it and do your best to stick to them. And that was the goal. Whether or not we achieved it, I think, is definitely, certainly ripe for question, and is going to be talked about, again, in the reviews that I'm mentioning, as well as by people in general. And so I think it behooves all of us who were involved in that, as well as the department as a whole, to look back on that and look at what lessons can be learned from it going forward. But again, I can't go into like the internal discussions that we had at this point because of those ongoing reviews there. So, and that's often disappointing to people who ask that question, so I know it is. But I do think that all of us are going to be faced with very, very challenging decisions to be made at some point in time. And I've always felt like if you outline those principles and then you stick to them, you will ultimately move through it in a way that people may not agree with, they may never agree with, but at least you can say this is why we did certain things. Now, other people may have had different ways of viewing that, and so that's one of the things we'll be looking at when they finally finish all these different reviews.
Here.
Thank you, Madam Attorney General. I was traveling on a day I heard the announcement that you had a meeting with former President Clinton at the airport or something. And the first thing I thought, what was she thinking? And so therefore, that's my question to you.
So that's come up before, as you can imagine, right? And I spoke about that also the day after it happened. I was traveling. President Clinton was traveling through Phoenix at the same time. He wanted to say hello and came on board to speak to me and my husband at the time and say hello. And it turned into a much longer conversation than it should have. And as I said the very next day, I recognized that was a mistake that I had made. And that my concern for that at that time was that I knew that it was going to cause concern about the handling of the email investigation, even though that was never discussed, because of the optics of it. And so what I did was something, again, as I mentioned, we have these objective principles, one of which is we don't talk about ongoing investigations. But I chose to speak about that one in terms of how it was going to be decided. And so a few days later, I talked about the fact that we had set up the system and the career team of prosecutors and lawyers were the ones working on the case. They were going to provide me with a recommendation, and I anticipated accepting their recommendation, as we often do in these cases. But I also thought it was important to talk about that because, from a leadership perspective, because what happens when you as a leader do make a mistake in a very high-profile matter, in a matter that does get a lot of publicity, And what do you choose to do and what do you choose to focus on? And so, you think about that a lot when you're in the middle of it. And I think it can be very tempting to sort of rush forward and say, well, this is what I was thinking. I didn't mean this, I didn't mean that. But sometimes that makes it all about you. And when you lead an organization, it has to be about the organization. It has to be about protecting the integrity of that organization, and in my case, the Department of Justice, and particularly the integrity of the investigation. So that's why, when I spoke about it at the time, I talked about this is how it's going to impact the case, which is not at all, because this is something that's being handled, on a separate chain, and it's essentially going to work its way through without input from me, and it had worked its way through without input from me, and so there would not be any impact on that. And I felt it was important to talk about that also, because you want people who work for you to see what happens when the boss makes a mistake too, and how that's going to be handled, and what they can expect as well.
Can I ask a question? What mistake did you make? He came onto your plane.
Well, as I've said, my view of it was supposed to be just a brief hello.
Okay.
And my view was that, in my view, and again, people view this in different ways. I also have very much the view that I don't blame other people for things that happen to me.
Why not?
Because I don't think it's really helpful.
I know. I know.
I feel like we're all responsible for our own actions, and we take responsibility for them. And everyone should do that. And some people do, and some people don't. That's their choice. I can't control what they do.
Yes.
I can only control what I do.
That's the right answer.
And how I respond to it. I can't. And also, the late great Maya Angelou says, if you complain and start blaming people, all you're doing is saying that there's a victim in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was about taking responsibility for it. Mm-hmm. And so my view is, I wish I had seen around that corner, and
go out the back of the plane,
go out the back of the plane, lock the door, whatever. But it was a very quick, and like many people often stop by in airports to say hello to me.
Yeah.
People, citizens or different people in public life, you see the AG and you say, oh, I want to say hi, and it would happen to me all the time. Mm-hmm. And usually it was just, hi, how are you? And I want you to meet this person or that person, and you move on, and there's no moment to it, and no great length to it. But this was different.
Yeah.
This was different, and because it was different, I felt I had to address it.
Yeah. Okay. Here? Yes.
Hi, I'm Dara Mowanel. I don't know if anybody said their name, but whatever. My question for you is just a little bit more about community policing, because I know that the Justice Department did some work in that space, and kind of what you see as like the future of community policing, what that looks like from prosecutorial and also like police departments.
Yeah, I think community policing is something that I've actually been working on those issues since the 90s, since the Louima case in New York. After we prosecuted the case, we were looking at issues within NYPD, but also just working with NYPD in other cases and seeing how really good police officers actually did interact well with the community and would have a positive relationship there, in stark contrast to what you saw in, for example, the Louima case, and seeing that that was in fact possible, and then how much safer that made a community, and what were the elements of that. So I spent a lot of time as Attorney General traveling around the country, looking at cities and talking with communities and law enforcement leaders who were working on those issues, and particularly working on them after having had a breakdown, a terrible shooting, law enforcement violence against unarmed civilians, or even the Department of Justice having to come in with a consent decree. And yet these communities had worked on that relationship and were in fact making real sustainable improvement. And so we did a lot of trying to connect police departments to others that were facing similar issues. We did a lot of supporting of peer-to-peer training within law enforcement. If one police department was facing a particular issue, they could reach out to sections of the department, particularly our community policing section, and get connected with a peer police chief who had been through those issues and could say, you don't want to go down this road. And so we were trying to do the same thing at the community level also. What that does for me in this particular time period, when there is a different focus coming from the Department of Justice, that is true. But the work that I saw was very positive at the community level. And it tells me that that's where those ideas begin, that's where that commitment begins, and and my hope is that the work that we did in the department during the time that I was there and even before that on strengthening those relationships and providing information and support to both sides in the discussion will not be in vain. I will tell you that it's not just the community that does not want to see this relationship crumble, because that often means that someone has lost their life. It's also law enforcement. I remember sitting with a group of police chiefs at the end of my tenure talking about a number of other issues, and one police chief saying to me, I never would have thought, as a police chief, that Ferguson, Missouri would come to be the face of policing in America. And they were as horrified by what they saw during that time period as those of us watching the TV were. And so the work that we did, I think, will continue to bear fruit. People have to make choices about what kind of community they want, what kind of policing they want. And I think we did do a lot to give both law enforcement and community members a lot of tools and a lot of support. And so I think that's where the work will be over the next several years. That's where you're going to see gains and progresses. You're going to see problems because it's not a perfect relationship. But my hope is that the work that we did in highlighting areas where those bridges had been built will be called into play the next time there is a terrible incident, and that people will be able to work through that and find both accountability and justice.
We have time for one more question. In the back there. Yes, you? No.
Hi, Megan. I'm a 2L. Thank you so much for being here. I hope this is an easy one. What recent nonfiction have you enjoyed? Or in other words, what should we all go home and read after this?
Oh,
Aside
gosh.
from Professor Gordon Reed's book, of course.
Not aside from.
I have to say I have not made a dent in my reading list. As I mentioned, I've been spending time with my family primarily because my parents have had some health challenges, and so my focus has been on that. And so I don't have a reading list to give to you. I think there are some wonderful things out there that I would like to be able to open. I can never praise enough my law school classmate Brian Stevenson's book. Can never praise that book enough for everybody. I think that his view of justice and equality and the path that we've been on as a country for a number of years is vital to anyone who thinks deeply about these issues. And there's too many that come to mind actually for me to start listing them now. But unfortunately, I have not yet gotten to many of them. My stack is very long on the Kindle.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Loretta.
Thank you.